Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. We've seen a significant uptick in focus and activities in the art world throughout Asia over the last few years. This hasn't been limited to just Hong Kong or mainland China, though. And in fact, most of the interest in the last year or so has been on other markets within Asia, such as Seoul or Singapore, where we've seen interesting and exciting art fairs emerge. This has been the case because of several reasons, which we'll explore today, including the fact that China's restrictive COVID travel policy has insulated the Chinese art market from the broader economy and art market. But we wanted to get an update on what exactly is happening in China at the moment and how things are looking moving forward. So in this week's episode of the podcast, we chat with Enid Tsui, who's based there in Hong Kong. She's the arts editor at the South China Morning Post. She chats with us about all these topics. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks so much for listening. Enid, thanks so much for coming on and joining us from Hong Kong.
My pleasure.
So for those of us not based in Hong Kong and mainland China, it seems like things have felt very insulated there the last few years with the extreme COVID travel restrictions. And as a result, for the art world, we've seen a lot of Chinese collectors, Chinese galleries having missed out on participating or attending art fairs and auctions and other events. And also galleries outside of China have really not had as much of a presence there the last couple of years. How has all of this impacted the art market there?
All things considered, there's a lot of good art still being made and the markets have largely held up. But it's been such a sad time and a surreal one when it was virtually impossible for anyone to travel in and out of Hong Kong and China without great difficulty for nearly 3 years. So for Hong Kong, where I'm based, even to cross over the border to China, or what we call mainland China, there were horrible quarantine and testing procedures. So most people didn't, right? And we are the same country. And like everywhere else, exhibitions were cancelled, museums were shut for long periods, and there were variations in the level of lockdown experience in different cities. So in Hong Kong, because it's semi-autonomous, the city could set its own pandemic rules and never went into full lockdown, like we saw in major mainland Chinese cities like Beijing and Shanghai. So commercial galleries here stayed open more or less uninterrupted. And many of them focused on works by local artists. I mean, like we've seen around the world, the pandemic was a time of for introspection and a time to reconnect with your local community because we were all stuck together. And for a small place like Hong Kong, that's the sense of community was really strong among the art community. And also in this city, a whole new political landscape has emerged and it has changed the way of life for many people. And it's been, after the 2019 protests and the subsequent introduction of a new national security law, it's been a time to lick wounds, to reflect or to move on. And a lot of local art reflects that. So maybe that's why more people have been looking at art and buying art. When the only holidays were staycations, galleries had a lot more footfall. And even people who never bought art before did. I was told that because eating out or social gatherings in restaurants wasn't easy with all the social distancing rules, home entertainment became more popular and people cared more about what they had on their walls. And then there's the embrace of NFTs in 2021. There were a lot of crypto firms in Hong Kong at one point before the government tightened regulations. So the now infamous FTX was founded here, and it spurred the arrival of a new digital art fair, NFT auctions by Christie's and Sotheby's, new galleries that jumped on the craze. And and then the auctions market. I mean, I think even the auction houses here were surprised by how the auction sales were so resilient during the pandemic. A lot of the action was online, very international. Christie's Hong Kong sold 835 million US dollars in 2022, the third highest on record, and exceeding pre-pandemic levels. Sotheby's Asia sold 1.1 billion US dollars, matching its 2021 all-time high. And all this is just as well since there are major expansion plans here. And the pandemic didn't stop new institutions from opening in Hong Kong or in mainland China. In Shanghai, we saw the opening of UCCA Edge. And of course, in Hong Kong, M Plus Museum finally opened, and it was certainly one of the most anticipated museum openings in the world. New local galleries have emerged, but the growth in international galleries opening here, well, it basically came to a halt. Certainly because of the fact that people had to quarantine for weeks when they arrived at one stage, and you could be taken to awful government facilities if you tested positive. China and Hong Kong are at least a year behind many other cities in dropping pandemic restrictions. And then another major problem, I think, for Hong Kong is an acute brain drain. That's being felt in every sector. And in art, the most important people are leaving, the artists, curators, museum specialists, because what used to be one of the most free cities in Asia now has a new censorship regime, and people are being detained or jailed under a new national security law. And also a lot of expat families have moved away in the last 3 years because of the quarantine requirements. It's been a really tough time, and yet tough times often create good art. And so it's still a very dynamic art scene, but with major worries ahead.
Well, you touched on a lot of different areas that I want to dig into further with you. We've seen significant expansion in the art world in Singapore and Seoul and other places in Asia, but outside of China. Do you think the political environment, as well as the COVID travel policies in China, has anything to do with this investment in Asia happening outside of China, or was this inevitably going to happen anyways?
I think it's both. The Asian demand for art has grown enormously. And so the fact that auction houses are returning after many, many years to Southeast Asia, having sales in Singapore, for example, would make sense anyway, because places like Indonesia, it's a massive economy with a lot of collectors. But I think what's changed is how centralized a lot of the art market was in Hong Kong, which was the beachhead for tapping into this regional demand. And actually, I mean, even China, I mean, even in mainland Chinese cities like Shanghai, it was attracting Western galleries like Listen, it didn't open in Hong Kong. Of course, with 1.4 billion people in China, Chinese cities will continue to be big markets. And Sotheby's has recently announced a new Shanghai headquarters. But the political reality, the restrictions, and the seeming frowning upon on the flaunting of wealth in China under President Xi Jinping's common prosperity strategy is making people fearful. And that's why we've seen all those family offices being set up in Singapore recently. I mean, in China and Hong Kong, it's not as if we've seen a sudden big wave of closures of galleries. It's just that the new ones are not coming in. So, for example, Lehman Open having closed their Hong Kong gallery space a couple of years ago, they've moved to a big, beautiful space in Seoul, but it's still on the lookout for a new space in Hong Kong. But I mean, Hong Kong is very small and there's not a lot of space here. Meanwhile, you have Seoul, one of the most mature, wealthy contemporary art markets in Asia, where Frieze is now happening. It has lots more space for nice galleries, and like Hong Kong, no tax on art. And it has the political stability that I think people don't see in a place like Hong Kong. And Singapore, it used to be considered quite dull, but after all the trauma of the past few years with COVID and everything, it's a really nice place to be. And of course, Singaporeans say to Hong Kongers like me, well, you used to have a big advantage over us, i.e., freedom of expression, and now you don't. And so there's all that happening, and it's I think people when collectors travel around the world, I mean, there's so many art fairs, there's so many new art hubs emerging. They want to go to places that are cool, right? You want to go where it's exciting, and I think with all the sort of the negative things that have happened in Hong Kong and China in recent years, we need to. The onus is on us to lure people back.
And in the US and Europe, the art market is still strong, I believe. But as we start 2023, there's a lot of discussion about a potential softening in the art market in really the broader economy later this year. In Hong Kong and mainland China, how is the art market at the moment? And is there any talk about a potential softening maybe occurring later this year?
I mean, we have seen amazing sales over the last few years. As I mentioned before, Christie's and Sotheby's has seen all-time highs or record near record levels. But the last set of auctions in the autumn here in Hong Kong were mixed. So there were big ticket items that couldn't find buyers, and nobody is expecting a miraculous recovery in the economy. It's interesting that because the borders with mainland China reopened on January 8th of this year, a lot of people were hoping to see a lot of mainland Chinese tourists flocking back. That has not happened. The forecast for China's GDP growth is, I think, the most optimistic forecast expects it to be below 5%. There's a lot of concern that China, even though its GDP forecast for 2023 is not bad. I mean, people are expecting growth to be as high as 4.9%, but because the Xi Jinping, but because there seems to be a discouragement on people to flaunt their wealth, there are concerns that people are not going to buy, big crazy items to show off anymore. So in the past, there would be a lot of demand for what Qing Dynasty emperors used, their chairs or their jade stamps. Not sure if people are that keen to buy those things anymore, and the economy is suffering after 3 years of draconian zero COVID policy. There have been rumors that private museums in China have put collections on the market. I mean, I haven't confirmed the veracity of these claims, but considering the economy and how the manufacturing sector has really suffered, it wouldn't be surprising.
I also want to ask you about private museums in China because it feels like, in particular during the pandemic, they have emerged as very serious buyers of contemporary art, hosting exhibitions by contemporary artists. A lot of collectors become frustrated outside of China. They try to get access to works on the primary market. Galleries say, oh, sorry, this work or that work is sold to a private museum in China. So it's something that's becoming a topic of conversation with more regularity in the last year or two. How important are these private museums in China in terms of serving the broader public as cultural institutions? And what are their roles exactly in the art ecosystem in China?
Well, to be honest, I haven't been to many of those either because I haven't been able to enter mainland China for the last 3 years. Um,
Yeah,
but
I guess a
the,
lot a
the
lot of
the
them are
word,
relatively new.
yeah. And so, what do they have in there? Not a lot of information. And people who have visited say that the quality remains very mixed, or a lot of empty space. There's some really excellent ones. Of course, we've still got the big, well-established ones like long museums. Um, but among the new ones, I think like Deji Art Museum in Nanjing has a good reputation. Um, and her museum in Guangdong province also. Um, but it's not clear that we're going to see the same rate of growth. And like I said earlier, um, there are rumors that some of these private museums are putting their collections on the market just because of the bad state of the economy. So it's interesting that speaking to gallerists in Hong Kong, they tell me that their client mix has shifted over the last few years. So before, yes, a lot of buying from China or Chinese private museums, but now it's become a lot more diverse. So a lot of very strong demand from places like South Korea and Taiwan, for example.
And so if we look ahead to Art Basel Hong Kong, which is still a few months away, but with travel restrictions lifted there, it seems like a lot of galleries that are based in the US and Europe and other parts of the world are excited to attend and not have to deal with any quarantine restrictions and haven't really been in Hong Kong in a few years. What's the anticipation like there? Is there an expectation that the fair may return to a close to normal pre-COVID time?
There is a great deal of excitement about Art Basel this year because it's so important. Art Basel has continued in Hong Kong during the pandemic, but obviously with very few overseas galleries actually sending their staff here, let alone artists, and the scale was much smaller. This year, there will be 177 galleries, which is a big increase from last year. But before the pandemic, we had 242 galleries. So it means nearly a third have not come back this year. And I mean, if you look at Art SG in Singapore, which I recently attended, okay, it's a lot less selective than Art Basel, but it had 160 booths. So before you could comfortably, I mean, before you could confidently describe Art Basel Hong Kong as the region's biggest art fair and so on. Well, 177 is not that much more than 160. Art Basel is really aware that it has to put on a good show. It has new leadership. Adeline Wee, who was the director of the Hong Kong Fair for many years, she remains the Asia director, but she will focus on the development of Art Basel's other initiatives in the region, and it's going to be a time to show the world that Hong Kong is still a good place to see good art, because there's this new climate of censorship, and people are not. I think speaking to galleries in the US and Europe, a lot of people are fearful that if there is one positive COVID case, they might shut down the fair like they did in Shanghai last year. I mean, in Hong Kong, that seems inconceivable, but that is the impression people have of Hong Kong and what might happen. So Hong Kong has a lot to prove, and I think that from what I've heard so far, there will be some really good exhibitions around town during that week.
Well, we'll certainly be following along with anticipation to see how the fair goes this year. Enid, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and sharing your really incredible perspective on just everything going on in the art market in mainland China and Hong Kong. If our listeners don't read your writings already, we definitely recommend that they do. And you're also on social media, often talking about the art market there. Where can we find you?
At Enid Tsui, ENID TSUI.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.